Staying in Contact. I'm London Mitchell. Those of you who are regular listeners to these weekly visits know that I love to discuss the history of our area, and one of my favorite guests over the years is Ted Long. I am reprising a chat I had with Ted about his book, Forgotten Visitors, an incredible read about famous people who paid forgotten visits to Northwest Ohio, including Susan B. Anthony, Babe Ruth, Wyatt Earp, Mother Teresa, and even Jumbo the Elephant. I started our chat by asking Ted about his inspiration to write the book.
Well, it's an interesting story because, it did just like literally pop in my head one day while I was reading a New York Times piece. It was actually what they call a backstory article, and it was about Wyatt Earp. And a fellow by the name of Alan Barra wrote the piece, and he was describing Wyatt Earp's involvement at the Dempsey-Willard fight in Toledo in 1919. And I was shocked. I mean, I first of all had no idea Wyatt Earp was around in 1919 and in Toledo. But the other part of it that just kind of blew me away was that not only was Wyatt Earp in Toledo in 1919 at that fight, but he was with Bat Masterson. So it was like, a shock for me to say, just picture in my mind what that must have looked like. And then in the piece, he described how Dempsey stepped into the ring for the big fight, looking out into the crowd, and saw and saw Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson taking guns from tough people in the crowd. And I was blown away. And I thought to myself, that is a forgotten story. What other forgotten visitors came to this area that you don't know about or you've never heard about? And so that's really what started me on this idea of researching forgotten visitors to Toledo.
I have a photograph of my grandfather with Jack Dempsey. He was a sports reporter for the Tribune, stationed in Paris at the time. I think that it's wonderful to look back at Toledo because many of us, and I think mostly native-born Toledoans, think Toledo is an also-run, so to
I
speak.
agree.
But Toledo really was on the map.
Absolutely. And I think, I've told you before, I've lived here over 30 years now, moved here from the Chicago suburbs. And when we arrived, my wife and I both were surprised at how often people who were born and raised here give Toledo a black eye. And we got here and we thought, wow, what a fantastic, perfect city in the Midwest to raise a family with all the amenities that it has. And yet when you talk to people who grew up here, they're like, there's nothing to do. Toledo's, backwoods, and, Toledo always gets it on the chin. And yet when you look back, well, first of all, today, I don't believe that at all. It's a vibrant city with lots to do. But when you look back, as you say, it really was on everybody's radar. It was, when you look at the visitors that came through town, for me, it was almost an exploration to find as many famous people as I could that came through as clear back as the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, before Toledo really started to industrialize and bring, this glass city image. It was still a town where people stopped because it was, first of all, it had, I think, second to Chicago in the number of railroads coming into town. You're sitting there right in the heart of the Midwest between Chicago and New York, just south of Detroit. So it was just an easy place for those folks to come through and visit. But plus, Toledo was a going town. It always has been.
Tell us a little bit more about the book. What can we find inside some of these forgotten stories, forgotten
Sure.
visitors?
Well, what's fun for me is the book is it starts from basically the 1790s and goes all the way through 2000. And so the first chapter, for example, is about Zebulon Pike and William Clark, two gentlemen who people know, most historians know, were at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And then where it gets tricky is people then say, and then they went on to become great discoverers of America. And actually, and each of my stories has some type of a twist. And in this particular story, the twist is Zebulon Pike, that was at Fallen Timbers, was the father of Zebulon Pike that we know for Pike's Peak. So there's a bit of a twist here and there. And then that's the first chapter. And then there's 24 more. And the last chapter is about Neil Young's visit in 2004, when he really appeared kind of as a surprise guest at a Pearl Jam concert at the Sports Arena. So it's a pretty diverse list of stories, and it's wide ranging.
We're talking about visitors Mark Twain,
Mark
Susan
Twain,
B. Anthony,
that's
Sarah
correct.
Bernhardt,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Again,
Al
these are
Capone.
Al Capone. That's right. Um, there are people, when you see the names, you're like, I didn't know that. Immediately it comes to your mind. I didn't think that, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle visited here several times. Basically the man who gave us Sherlock Holmes. Jumbo the Elephant, 1883. You mentioned Mark Twain, 1869. Twain was interesting for me because, in 1869, obviously the country's pulled out of the Civil War. Toledo is a big town, a growing town, and rather famous town at that point because of Petroleum v. Nasby. And Robinson Locke had taken over the Blade and was pushing his Nasby stories across the country through the Blade. But the other interesting thing to me at that time was Toledo didn't really have a major venue for these types of speakers or performances. It was a city of halls. You had White's Hall, College Hall, Stickney Hall. They were just places along the road where people turned them into event venues. And it wasn't until really the Wheeler Opera House that Toledo had, a great venue to host those kinds of people. And then obviously the Valentine Theater after that. Sarah Bernhardt shows up eventually in the late 1800s, 1880s, and the Wheeler Opera House hadn't been here. I'm not sure we would have hosted her then.
This whole idea of Toledo being on the circuit, I think, for a lot of famous people, maybe the word circuit isn't proper, but I remember my father once telling me, who was native-born Toledoan, said that Toledo was the place where many of the stars, especially in burlesque, would come. And if you failed in Toledo, because Toledo was a really tough crowd,
right,
you were done. I mean, a lot of people talk about Peoria, but really it was Toledo.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting story in the I cover quite a bit about Houdini. Houdini shows up in really two chapters, one on his own, and then the other he shows up in the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle story. And I'll not give that story away. You'll have to read the book to connect the two dots. But Houdini, early in his career, after he had married his wife and they started the Great Houdini's tour, he actually came close to giving up his whole career after basically being shut down in Toledo because he couldn't sell enough tickets. And he ended up actually kind of going away with his tail between his legs and deciding, what to do next, when he stumbled onto a relationship with a big time promoter out of Minnesota. And that really saved his day. But it was a terrible week in Toledo that almost put Houdini out of business.
I'm London Mitchell. My guest this week, staying in contact, is local author Ted Long. We are discussing his book, Forgotten Visitors, Northwest Ohio's notable guests. The list includes Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Houdini, Mark Twain, even Wyatt Earp. How, Ted, did you go about the research for the book?
Well, it was a year of a lot of deep research. Obviously, the internet is huge and always a great place to do some of that research, but you can't do it all there. We spent quite a few hours in the Toledo Lucas County Public Library over on the main library in the third floor at the local history department. The people there were fantastic. Did a ton of microfilm research, just pouring through old copies of the Blade, the Newsbee, and anything else we could get our hands on. A lot of book reading. I did quite a bit of research also, just looking at other books that have been written over the years about, great people in American history, and kind of picking out the ones that intrigued me and the ones that had a twist and obviously involved Toledo.
Ted Long is the author of Forgotten Visitors, Northwest Ohio's Notable Guests, published by the University of Toledo Press. I'm London Mitchell, inviting you to join me next week, staying in contact.